Hello, so me again. We're now moving on to session number 2, and we're going to be looking at natural resources and well-being. So in this session, we're kind of covering a little bit of everything. We're covering blue spaces, agriculture itself, and also the effects it has on farmers. So first, we're going to start with Lydia Hubbard from the University of Salford, who's doing a master's looking at blue spaces and how it affects mental well-being, specifically in urban spaces in the time of the pandemic. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this will work. There we go. Perfecto. Okay, and then we shall start her presentation.
Hi, so my name's Lydia Hubbard and I'm studying a Master's in Sustainability at the University of Salford. For my dissertation research, I've decided to focus on blue space and in particular investigate how being active in blue spaces in England can impact mental health within urban areas. Today, I'm going to talk about the current literature on blue space and what are the next proposed steps for my dissertation research. Please feel free to ask any questions at the end of the presentation, as I would love to hear what you think about the subject. So first of all, what is blue space? According to studies from White et al. 2016 and Grelier et al. 2017, blue space is a visible outdoor water space that includes natural environments like lakes, rivers, and the sea, and man-made environments like lidos, harboursides, and wave pools. The photo on the slide demonstrates how natural blue spaces can also be featured in urban areas to create urban blue space. In terms of urban development, Volker et al. 2016 regarded blue space as a key component for supporting sustainability, human health, and landscape contextualization. The research developed Volker and Kerstmann's 2011 findings on how water is an important aesthetic and physical landscape element for environmental design and psychology. It can, though, be hard to separate blue spaces from green spaces and identify the associated impacts, as both forms often occur together. For example, the UK government's COVID-19 Mental Health and Wellbeing Recovery Action Plan involves connecting communities to green spaces as a method to improve mental health. The action plan includes developing one of the world's longest coastal paths, featuring both green and blue spaces. Although the coastal development has been classified as green space, it questions if the benefits to mental health will come from the blue space element. Systematic reviews on the exposure to blue space, physical activity, and mental health have provided consistent evidence on the positive relationship between the three elements. However, the further research is needed on understanding the impacts of man-made urban blue spaces on mental health. Previous literature has also focused on the interlinking impacts of using natural blue spaces to benefit human and environmental health. For example, using the sea for physical activity increases awareness of polluted oceans and plastic waste on beaches. I'm yet to come across literature on how the same process of using blue spaces to improve mental health can also improve the maintenance of man-made urban blue spaces like harboursides and canals. This is of importance as Volker and Kerstmann's 2011 research identified that perceptions of the aesthetic quality of water were strongly influenced by subjective matters like mood, choices of activities, and environmental value orientations. When looking at mental health well-being trends in England over the past 3 years, I became aware of the increasing suicide mortality rates. So in 2019, suicide mortality rates in England increased a further 0.5 per 100,000 population compared to 2018. This equates to 5,316 deaths that year, with a large proportion being male. A study measuring mental health before and during the COVID-19 pandemic identified that by late April 2020, mental health in the UK had deteriorated compared with pre-COVID-19 trends. Although happiness levels in June 2021 are now similar to pre-pandemic levels, the rise of suicide mortality rates pre-COVID-19 highlights mental well-being as a concern for England. The impact of COVID-19 on mental health is becoming an increasing global concern, and populations living in urban areas reported high levels of psychological distress from lockdown restrictions. As a result, the pandemic has created more challenges in achieving the set Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, especially for Goal 3 of ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Research analysis on the psychological distress from the pandemic identified environmental factors as a direct effect and a key indicator for public health and environmental planning to improve and sustain mental well-being. This is because populations who had access to outdoor spaces and natural views experienced higher levels of positive emotions and associated the contact with nature as a coping strategy for lockdown restrictions. The gap in literature on the relationship between man-made blue space, physical activity and mental health, alongside studies into the psychological distresses during the pandemic, formulated my dissertation focus and research questions to advance academic knowledge in understanding the relationship between physical activities, types of blue spaces and mental well-being, as well as ensure mental well-being is sustainable within urban areas in England. Although quarantine and lockdown measures have affected mental well-being, according to McCartan et al. 2021, the crisis has created an innovative opportunity in connecting physical and mental health. When looking at grey literature, there are several case studies expressing the mental health benefits from being active in blue spaces, for example, open water swimming, stand-up paddleboarding and surfing. Mental well-being support programs have been designed and use blue spaces for physical activities. These programs are known as Blue Care and are used as a service of NHS social prescribing in certain areas in England. An example is the WAVE project, a surf therapy program that helps children and young people with mental health conditions. Marshall et al. 2019 researched into the benefits that surf therapy has on participants of the WAVE project program. The study identified that surf therapy creates a sense of belonging and connectedness for participants, as well as the self-belief and confidence from learning a new skill. The authors used the self-determination theory to conceptualize the findings. The connectiveness of the program interlinks with the basic human need of connecting and interacting with others. Enjoying the process of learning to surf and visually seeing the skills developed relates to empowering independence and self-belief and confidence in achieving and overcoming a difficulty. Marshall et al.'s theorized pathways correlate to the connect, be active and learn elements of the 5 ways to well-being, a step-by-step formula developed by the New Economics Foundation in partnership with the NHS to improve mental capital and well-being. So, continuing to enjoy a physical activity enhances psychological well-being by connecting with others, being active and learning new skills. Britton et al. 2020 produced the first systematic review on Blue Care programs and identified that mental health, especially psychosocial well-being, can be improved with investment in blue spaces. However, both studies use natural blue spaces to gather data, emphasizing the limited research on man-made blue spaces and how they can be used to benefit mental well-being. Marshall et al. Did suggest that the positive outcomes of using blue spaces to improve mental well-being should be optimized in different blue space environments and physical activities. But is there a need for urban blue space? According to the United Nations, 68% of the world population is projected to live in urban areas by 2050. Studies into urban blue space identified that accessibility and use of urban community spaces will become an increasing priority to improve physical and mental well-being. Blue spaces have also been identified as a possible solution to alleviate public health concerns related to the growing urban population. and Volker et al.'s 2016 study showed that cities with urban blue spaces increase physical activity and diversifies health experience for residents. The research therefore identifies the opportunities for public health in urban planning and landscape design. When looking at theoretical frameworks, Volker et al. 2016 used the humanistic, behavioural and professional paradigm as a theoretical framework to analyse analysts to determine urban open spaces for health-related appropriations. So the humanistic element represents the human-environment interaction. The behavioural element represents human experience and relationship with interacting with the specific environment. And the professional element analyses the expert and non-expert landscape quality evaluation to identify the assessment criteria from planners compared to the general public. Volker and Kisterman 2011 created the matrix of therapeutic landscapes for future researchers to use when analysing the impacts of blue space on mental health. So the 4 dimensions of the appropriation aspect of the matrix considers human behaviour and why the space is used for activities. The 5 dimensions of substantiality analyses the physical aspects of the space, so in terms of knowledge and construction, as well as the subjective associations like fresh air and what the space represents. So to underpin my dissertation research, I'm going to convert the paradigm into a donut model to demonstrate the influencing factors of all 3 elements, and then use the matrix of therapeutic landscapes to analyse key themes from findings. So what are the next steps of research? So to achieve the working aim, I've already begun to explain the relationship between physical activities, types of blue spaces, and mental well-being, and how nature was used for psychological distress during the pandemic. I also want to discover how being active in blue spaces can help achieve Sustainable Development Goal 3, as mental health is an integral part of the Sustainable Development Goals. The slide outlines the proposed methodology for collecting primary data. The mixed method approach will collect quantitative and qualitative data from online questionnaires, a follow-up focus group, and interviews with experts and non-experts to identify the humanistic, behavioural, and professional elements of the paradigm. The combined findings will formulate recommendations on how engagements with urban blue spaces as an everyday occurrence can improve and sustain mental well-being in England. I also intend to create small case studies on the Wave at Bristol and Inland Waves Yorkshire to explain how health and well-being can be improved by connecting people with nature and each other through the enjoyment of being active in man-made blue spaces. So that's it so far. Thank you so much for listening to my talk on blue space research, and I really hope you found it insightful. If you would like to participate in primary data collection, please contact me via email, and you can actually follow my dissertation research on Instagram via @bluespace_research. There'll be now an opportunity to ask any questions or give feedback on the talk with a quick live Q&A session with myself and Louise. Thank you.
It's such a good talk. Thank you so much, Lydia. Like, it's so interesting, and knowing some of the people that are on the chat as well, there'll be loads of people that will really be interested in this sort of research as well. You've got loads of different questions in the chat. Feel free to kind of jump in if there's any that you want to kind of pick out and answer in the first place. I noticed you'd already responded to Mike's.
I didn't know whether just to start typing or wait till the end.
Do what you want to do, it is great. There's another question there as well. Do you think that you're going to find out more about man-made blue spaces or more natural spaces? What one do you think is more beneficial, just from what you've been reading, for human health?
I think more like man-made. So one thing I wanted to touch base on as well is, but I don't know if it's a bit too big for the dissertation, but we all know about there's a lot of research about the natural, and but not everyone has like easy accessibility to natural. So I wanted to like look into how to make blue space an everyday occurrence. So it's like it benefits people's mental health before mental health becomes like, in terms of the spectrum, to like decrease the severity of it. So then that will like alleviate pressures from the NHS and things like that. So it's kind of, that's why I've used the word like mental well-being. So kind of using, like looking into making more man-made blue spaces to like improve everyday well-being, so that like we're looking after our mental health without realizing we're looking after our mental health, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I think it's a really nice way of kind of encapsulating what you're looking at as well. You're obviously at the really early stages of the research as well, and looking at everything that you've planned, like you're so organised. You're so there. I just wondered if it was maybe worth kind of asking you if you think that there's anyone that you need to kind of contact to be able to bring into the research, just to try and help you out on the research as well.
I guess like policymakers, that would be amazing, because obviously if I'm focusing more on urban development, and like stemming on from like what Mike was saying, trying to get permission for all of these things and the funding for it all, and that's like obviously a massive thing. So trying to understand like what are the barriers within all of that so it can be achieved.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and that's also a call to everyone in the audience. If you've got any sort of contacts to help as well, feel free to send them across to Lydia. I'm very cautious of time as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask if you could respond to any other sort of questions in the chat box, and we're going to move on to our next speaker, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you so much for letting me speak and have an opportunity to do this. So yeah, thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. The next speaker we've got is Alexandra. You're perfect. You ready to go and share your screen?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm good to go. All right. Oops. Yeah. All right. Can you see my slide well?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Well, good afternoon from me to everyone. So far, it's been absolutely brilliant. It's my first time at this conference. I must say it's really mind-boggling to see so many different things that can be researched in the geographies and hills. And I hope to add to that very different, yet again, because I look at food environments. So let me introduce myself. I'm Alexandra. I'm a second-year PhD student from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Birkbeck College. And today I want to present how I combine two secondary data sources to characterize the out-of-home food environment in the UK. So to give you a little background, the food environment is very basically what we buy and eat, and it has been shown to be connected to diet and health outcomes. So for example, the consumption of fast food, body weight, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease have been shown to be linked to the food environment. So the focus of my research, at least for today, however, lies on the local out-of-home food environment, which is the entirety of outlets that can be visited to consume food out of the home. So that would include restaurants and hot food takeaways or pubs. Out-of-home food, whether it's consumed from takeaway outlets or in restaurants, has been shown to be less healthy than meals that have been cooked at home. However, there's no standard classification of what the out-of-home food environment actually is. So this leads to a variety of applied definitions of restaurants and takeaway outlets. And this is a problem because we can't compare studies that use very different classifications. And there are researchers who argue that this variation is part of the reason that there's a lot of mixed evidence on the relationship between the food environment and health outcomes. So, oh yeah, I forgot my little question mark. Well, one approach to overcome this problem is to use official classifications, such as the use class from the planning system. So whenever a new outlet well, plans to open up or is built or changes their primary function, it has to apply with the council for permission to operate under this new function, and this is called a use class. The use class of restaurant and hot food takeaways is also used when policies are designed that address these establishments. And this use class can be obtained from through the food hygiene rating scheme, which is published through the Food Standards Agency. So whenever you, for example, want to get information on the hygiene rating of whichever food outlet, you can go to the Food Standards Agency website, look it up there, and it returns the rating, but also gives you in the further information of the business class or the business type, gives you the use class. So the objectives of my research were to retrieve policy relevant definitions, but for historical food outlet data, by combining data sources that provide both. The second aim was then to use these data to explore the out-of-home food environment and link it to area deprivation in my study area. So my study area comprised 630 postcode districts in Greater London and Northern England. And Northern England includes regions in the Northeast, the Northwest, and Yorkshire and the Humber. For each of these postcode districts, then, we took a reference point, which we defined as the population weighted centroid. So that would be the point in each postcode district that is located closest to most of the resident population. So here we see NW5, which is a postcode district in North London. The circle is the geographic centroid, so that's just the center of the area, and this cross is the population weighted centroid. So the assumptions that were made do influence the spatial scale a lot, and that of course needs to be considered when interpreting our results. So these were our reference points or addresses, and we then went on to build a neighborhood from there. And reference neighborhoods were, from this point, someone went 1 kilometer along the street network in every possible direction. And the endpoints of all these routes were then combined and built these little almost circular buffers for London, at least. And this was what we then defined as the neighborhood. And we looked at the exposure within these neighborhoods. Then we retrieved our data first on area deprivation from the UK government. These were the so-called English indices of deprivation from 2019. And we used only the dimension of income deprivation for each of the postcode districts. We then obtained food outlet data from the Ordnance Survey points of interest, and we collected them for 2019 and for 2020, both so spring in both years. And we cross-referenced these data then against data from the food hygiene rating scheme from the FSA. And I want to give you a little more information on how we did that. So the points of interest data already comes with their own definitions of what the outlets entail, because if you're familiar with the points of interest, you know that everything is contained in the points of interest. So of course, we didn't want to run everything against the database, but we looked for categories where we assumed that we would find restaurants and takeaway outlets. And these categories were called fast food delivery, restaurants, cafes, bakeries, delicatessens, fish and chips, pubs, bars and inns, and confectioners. We then took, so we filtered all of our points of interest data for both years for these outlets, and we then took the postcodes of these outlets as input to in the Food Standards Agency database. And for each of these input postcodes, we retrieved up to 10 matches, basically scraped the FSA data, saved up to 10 matches, and then in the next step, run a name match. So match the name of the FSA to the point of interest data to filter out the geographical matches to more meaningful matches. So in a nutshell, this whole process was a postcode and a name match. In a final step then, we imputed the use class for missed chain outlets as the most common use class for other outlets of the same brand. So for example, if a Nando's hasn't been matched, so it has not resulted in a match from the FSA database for whatever reasons, but most of the other Nando's were matched and classified as restaurants, then the missed Nando's will be classified as a restaurant too. We then used these freshly classified data to build food environment exposure measures, and we built both distance and density measures. The distance to the closest either restaurant or takeaway outlet was measured in meters from the reference point in each postcode district along the road network to the closest establishment. And that was computed with ArcGIS Desktop. The density of food outlets was determined as the number of outlets in a neighborhood divided by the size of the neighborhood in square kilometers. And this was done in R. And everything what you see from here, it has been done in R too. For the results first of our name match, after we reduced the points of interest data to the potential restaurants and takeaway outlets, we were left with 258,605 outlets for both years, 2019 and 2020. And after cross-referencing them with the Food Standards Agency data, 169,515 outlets of them were matched, which corresponds to 75.9% that resulted in matches. Now, not all of the matched outlets were for restaurants and takeaways, but also other use classes, for example, retail. So finally, out of all the matches, just under 40% of them were classified as restaurants, and about 28% were classified as takeaway outlets. When we imputed the chain outlets, so the missed ones, and just inferred their class from other outlets of the same brand, we found that actually quite a substantial proportion of outlets were imputed. So it's around 10% of out of all the classified restaurants were imputed because they were missed within a brand. And that's just under 4% for takeaway outlets. When we then look at the resulting exposure measures, we see a median density of restaurants of 2.5 outlets per square kilometer in 2019, and a median distance to the closest restaurant of 690 meters. And that was the density of restaurants was a little higher in 2020 with 2.9 outlets per square kilometers, and the distance to the nearest restaurant a little smaller with 670 meters. And the same can be observed for takeaway outlets, which present with 3.8 outlets per square kilometers, a slightly lower density in 2019 compared to 4 outlets per square kilometer in 2020. And conversely, the median distance to the nearest takeaway outlet was 640 meters in 2019 and 578 meters in 2020. The same can, of course, be observed for the total out-of-home outlets, which is just the sum of takeaway outlets and restaurants. All these measures present a considerable variation as indicated by the interquartile ranges. And finally, we linked this to area deprivation and found some associations of the out-of-home food environment with the deprivation of an area. So what I show here is data from 2019, but it's the same for 2020. So here we see the density of out-of-home outlets grouped by area deprivation. And the coding is the lower the deprivation rank quantile, the higher deprived is an area. So here we see that with increasing area deprivation, the out-of-home density increases too. And when we tested this relationship with the Spearman rank correlation, this corresponds to a small association. And conversely, we see the same with distances, where distances decrease, so get smaller with increasing area deprivation. And again, this corresponds to a small association. To reflect on our approach of matching the point of interest data with Food Standards Agency data, So on the upside, we were able to combine the benefits of both data sets. So we could assign historical points of interest data with policy relevant classifications from the Food Standards Agency data. And more generally, using secondary data is usually less resource intensive. And this particular procedure, which is completely automated, imposes a little extra effort to improve the classification. However, limitations are that given both the points of interest and Food Standards Agency sources were found to be around 80% sensitive, meaning that they miss about 20% of outlets in the field. That means then that when we combine these two and only include outlets in our study that appear in both data sets, that might lead to quite some data lost. And we did not assess the extent of this potential data loss within the current work. And furthermore, as the Food Standards Agency data is kept up to date, outlets that closed before we retrieved the Food Standards Agency data are likely not to be matched. And this means that data are potentially biased so that more or only currently operating outlets are matched. And even though the effort was made to capture the chain outlets, the risk of missing outlets, especially the independent establishments, remains. So this needs to be considered when using such a procedure and interpreting the results. So keeping this in mind, we merged two data sources, which enabled us to assign policy relevant definitions to historical out-of-home food environment data. And using this, we could explore the links between area deprivation and the out-of-home food environment. So these are the references I used for this talk today. And I thank you very much for your attention, and stop sharing my screen so I can see you again.
It was such a good talk. Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear the quantitative side of research as well. I have a question. Anyone else pop one in the chat as well? My kind of question was, what kind of impact do you see your research having? Like, what do you want to kind of cause as a consequence of doing your research?
So that's a brilliant question. It's always about what do we do with it in the end. So what we see is a lot of policies. That's why I brought this up, this policy relevant definition. A lot of policies are designed around the use class. And so in some, at least for the evaluative impact, for example, when policies are implemented, can we then assess, but do they work? For example, when the government decided to prevent new takeaway outlets to open up in the perimeter of schools, for example. So this is one area where this procedure helps. Thinking more specifically about this approach, one could use the historic points of interest data to see how has that changed over time. For example, have really less takeaway outlets opened over schools? Has that, how many were there before the policy was implemented? How many were there after? And see, has this actually changed a lot? And of course, then linking that to dietary data from, for example, consumption of takeaway food by school children. So this is just to think of a very specific one area, but generally, or very, very broadly, this area of research around food environments looks at how the built environment influences our behaviors. How do humans interact with their environment, and what are the pathways? Is it as simple as there is a specific type of outlet in my neighborhood and therefore I'm exposed and use it, or is it more complicated than this? And for example, to which populations would it apply, or is the exposure greater than to another subgroup of the population?
That was great. Thank you so much that you answered it so well as well. What I'm going to move on to the next one, and then I'm hoping that we'll have like a collective where all four presenters can come back at the end, and I can chuck loads of other general questions at all of you. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. We're going to move over to Theo now, who is a PhD student at Salford. I think she is able to share her screen as well.
Yes. Hi, Louise.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Okay, so I'll just do that now. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
My name is Tayo, and I'll be presenting on the topic Enabling Urban Agriculture in the Global North and South, a comparative study of the UK and Nigeria. So just to give a bit of background to this, an estimated 10 billion people are projected to be on the planet by 2050. This implies that there will be a huge increase in the world's population by then. And because of this increase, the capacity to feed the population is an issue, especially in the cities, because urbanization increases across the world and competition for vital resources is on the rise as well. There are significant challenges in fighting food insecurity, and the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified the weaknesses of the global food systems by disrupting the food logistics and reduction in access to agricultural labor. So, urban agriculture has been found to be successful in some global north countries, but the situation is different in the global south. There are different limitations that are affecting the global south, such as policy changes, urban planning, and land availability. So this research aims to address certain gaps in literature, and these gaps range from the benefits and potential impact of urban agriculture on the community, and the importance and implication of both small and large-scale urban agriculture on food security. Also, there's a significant gap in knowledge on the perception and practice of urban agriculture, as well as the lack of data on comparison of urban agriculture in different countries. Also, there's inadequate literature and lack of research data, especially around upscaling urban agricultural practice and incorporating it into the urban system is an issue as well. So the major aim of this research is to appraise urban agriculture activity in both the global north and the global south through a case study approach while exploring its existing practice and its future potential around upscaling practice. So the objectives of this research are: one, to critically compare approaches to city food growing in both the global north and south, to characterize the perception of different stakeholders towards urban agriculture and its potential to enhance food sustainability, to assess the impact of urban agriculture on food security, sufficiency, and quality, to evaluate the policy tools that can enable urban agriculture in both Nigeria and the UK, and also to ascertain the barriers that affect urban agriculture in both locations, such as poor soil quality and contamination issues. And at the end of the data collection, to develop a framework that can help for decision making on urban agriculture in the global south as well. Okay, so a case study will be selected from each of the categories shown, from the informal growing site, the community growing, and the high-tech growing sites. So the methodology for this research is mainly qualitative. And unlike qualitative survey is being done to gather a wide range of responses from people in both locations, and semi-structured interviews are being carried out to know about people's experiences and their challenges and things like that. Okay, so far, because this research is still ongoing, there are certain factors that have been found to be affecting urban agriculture in the global south. The major one is difficult access to land in the cities. So because of lack of planning and zoning and things like that, there is usually a serious difficulty in accessing land in the cities in the global south. Policy tools, there's non-existent policy tools from the government to support urban agriculture in the global south. Also, there are other general barriers and contamination issues that are affecting urban agriculture as well. Another issue is the problem of security. People don't feel safe to have farms in the cities because of the issue of theft and things like that. Also, there's the issue of gender inequality as well. I found out in the course of my research that more men are generally more inclined to have access to farms in the cities than women. There's a gender inequality issue there. Also, there's a perception of unconventional urban agriculture methods, which is basically the new high-tech farms are being adopted, but people have a different perception to it. Some feel it might not be healthy or things like that. But yeah, so there's the perception issue as well affecting that. So far, to enable upscaling practice, it's been recommended that, okay, government needs to come in to create more favorable policies that support urban agriculture specifically. Also, there needs to be an adequate enlightenment on the new urban agricultural methods to show that, oh, okay, this is healthy, this is good, this can actually work. There needs to be an enlightenment about that. Also, when planning and zoning in the urban areas, there needs to be an inclusion of urban agriculture in planning and zoning as well. Also, there needs to be the provision of policy tools to support urban agriculture. So far, this research has been able to understand the different types of urban agriculture in the Global South and its impact on individual household sufficiency. It has also been able to provide an insight on the barriers surrounding policy implementation, actualization, and effectiveness, which influences upscaling practice. It's also helped to understand stakeholders' perspective and knowledge of new and unconventional urban agriculture methods. Also, it has helped to address the impact of urban agriculture on food sufficiency and quality. So going forward, because the research is still ongoing, more data needs to be collected from policymakers to help understand the challenges of whatever issues is going on from that end, to see how it's affecting urban agriculture, or why there are no favorable policies that are affecting that can favor urban agriculture, Also, the urban farmers, more urban farmers are now open or inclined towards adopting these new urban agricultural methods. So we would like to get more data from these farmers to know their experiences, the challenges, how easy it is to adopt this method, and how the setting up and everything has been so far. Also, I would like to get more data from wider international context. So people generally that are involved in urban agriculture from different parts of the world, to see how it's been done in different locations, in different places, and how these things are being carried out, especially in places that urban agriculture has been found to be successful. So yes, thank you all for listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. It's such an interesting insight into your research as well. My kind of first question was like a really generalized question. I kind of perceive that COVID's probably affected your data collection methods. I just wondered if you'd be able to kind of feed back on how your data has changed because of COVID.
Yeah, so initially I planned to have focus groups, and I planned to travel over to Nigeria to have this done. But COVID has affected that, because I've not been able to travel as at when due. So that made me adjusted the research methodology. That's where I brought about the online qualitative survey to gather a bit of responses without having to move from where I am at the moment. So yeah, that's what has been adjusted so far. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much for kind of highlighting that as well. When you kind of say about data going forward as well, you're still planning on collecting quite a lot. I just wondered if your plan was qualitative going forward, and if you were thinking about feeding recommendations back to policymakers in the global north and the global south, and how we can kind of learn from both aspects of the project.
Yes, so because in the global north countries, we've had a bit of success in some locations, but this is different in the global south. So the data collected will definitely help the policymakers in the global south. So I'm going to be giving some feedback and some recommendations to policymakers in the global south, and hopefully that might improve or change their minds about urban agriculture, because they have a different perspective over there. So hopefully my feedback will help them to see, oh, okay, there are some benefits to urban agriculture, and maybe we can include it in planning and things like that going forward, you know.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's always like an experience to learn from each other. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over to our last presenter in the session as well. So Alexis, hopefully, are we here? Yes.
Hi.
Perfect. Are you happy sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to move over to Alexis. Maytooth, that's wrong how to pronounce that?
Maytooth.
Maytooth. And we're going to be looking at how farmers' health and well-being has been affected over the time of the pandemic. So over to you.
Thank you. So my name is Alexis O'Reilly and I'm a PhD student in Maynooth University, and my research is supported by Teagasc, Agricultural and Food Development Authority in Ireland. And my supervisors are Dr. David Meredith and Dr. Ronan Foley, and the research is on farmers and their well-being during Ireland's COVID-19 pandemic. And this is part of a broader study. My PhD is on farmers' well-being and mental health. So studies internationally have found an increase in depression and in anxiety that's been linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. And research in Wuhan, China has found that restrictions have resulted in restrictions on the COVID-19 pandemic have resulted in poor mental well-being, an increase in symptoms of anxiety, depression, and harmful alcohol use. And similar findings in the United States, with an increase in symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression. And the Central Statistics Office in Ireland has also found 11.5% of people feeling downhearted or depressed, all or most of the time, in November 2020, and that's up from 5.5% in April 2020, and an increase as well in people feeling lonely all the time or most of the time, from 13.7%, which is up from 6.8%. So it's quite consistent across populations, the findings in terms of the impact that COVID-19 has had on well-being. So there are a number of features of rural areas that may make people at a greater risk of COVID-19. So demographic features, infrastructural and economic features. And there's an older population in rural areas as well. So they may struggle to meet the healthcare, social and basic needs of this population during the pandemic. So there's also issues to do with healthcare infrastructure, and a lack of online connectivity may make people at greater risk of isolation. So there is a literature that's established the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the well-being of healthcare staff, and this exists during the SARS pandemic and also during COVID-19. So other research around other sort of essential workers has yet to be done, and farmers have had to continue working during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in Ireland, farmers are generally older and they would be at a greater risk of severe illness or death if they contracted COVID-19. And farmers have had to adapt to using more technology and online resources to buy animals, to sell animals. And while there may be perception that rural areas are safer during the pandemic, there's rural communities in Ireland's border region and on the west coast of Ireland that have been severely affected by COVID-19. So my research project aims to interview between 15 and 30 farmers, and using qualitative methods, semi-structured interviews, and to establish how COVID-19 has affected farmers in terms of their occupation, socially and personally, and what role exposure to green space and exercise has for farmers in terms of their own sense of well-being, farmers' sense of job satisfaction, how important they feel their work to be, and the positive effect that this may have, and what their experience of the pandemic has been, has it varied over time, and what they feel has helped them during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I've interviewed 6 farmers in Ireland's border region, between the ages of 40s and 80s. 4 live with families and 2 live alone, 5 male farmers and 1 female farmer. And this was a region that was affected by a very high number of cases, higher than the national average in Ireland during the pandemic. So social support is a key factor in determining health outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And farmers live in rural areas, and by the nature of their occupation, they spend long periods of time working alone. So this may place them at a greater risk of isolation and as a consequence of poor well-being. So in terms of the farmers that interviewed, all have stated that they used the phone or social media to contact friends, family during the pandemic, to connect with religious communities. And some had felt that the pandemic had actually offered them more time to spend with their families. So all of them, however, have identified a cohort of farmers who they would feel are particularly at risk during the pandemic. Older farmers, farmers who live alone, for example. So, for example, one person said, you know, those guys would be there weekly at a mart, and they really found a big impact because they lost their social outings, and they also lost their knowledge of what the markets were like for cattle. And another person said all their social outlets completely shut. The postman is firing in letters from the road nearly. People who called around to them now afraid to bring anything to them. So I'd say all their social outlets are completely gone. And adapting to COVID-19 has meant a greater reliance on online resources, click and collect businesses to adjust to the pandemic. And generally the older farmers I interviewed had assistance with this from a relative who farms alongside them. And it's bringing about a new division of labour or delineation of responsibilities on farm. So noticing a younger generation, for example, in farm families who are taking more responsibility for dealing with sort of online resources. And so far the farmers I talked to have not said that they missed in-person marts. Some of them felt that the new situation afforded them a sort of greater convenience. So, you know, a lot of people are online farmers. It suited them great. They can work during their tea break or their lunch break. They can watch trades online. They're delighted they can buy their stock and go and collect them. And another farmer stated that while she did not like marts, they weren't like a social or recreational event for her. She was cautious of buying animals from online marts. If I was buying animals, would I buy them by looking at a picture on a phone? Probably not, no. So of the farmers I spoke to, many were very enthusiastic about their work. This was tied up very closely with work with animals and with their experience of green space. So one farmer said, for me, farming is absolutely my passion. I absolutely love it. If I had loads of money, I would stay at home farming and I wouldn't go to work. I would stay at home. So weather doesn't really bother me, and be it snow, be it sunshine, it doesn't matter. I like being outside in general, but I love animals. I love them, I love being with them, I love working around them. And another farmer, I love farming, I think it's a great, healthy way of life. You're out in the clean open air, it's nice to see the cows. You're bringing up the cows of a summer's evening there, and the big udders on the cows, and they're toddling along. It's lovely to watch, and you let them out and they go into the green fields of grass. It's nice, it's beautiful. So many farmers I interviewed felt themselves to be very fortunate during the COVID-19 pandemic, relative to neighbours, friends that they had who had a different experience of the pandemic because of a different line of work. And many farmers I spoke to felt that really the changes in their work regime were minimal, and that this was something very beneficial for them. You hadn't to change your lifestyle, you kept it going on, the very same as usual. You're working the same hours compared to people whose work is closed down and staying home with nothing to do. But as regards to farming, it went on. As I say, as the first lockdown, kind of fear eased off and people learned to live with it. You had a bit of freedom then. And one farmer I spoke to felt that her farm was an important resource for her when schools were closed down. She said, even with the children being off school, I don't know what I would have done. With the kids at home for the guts of a year, if I had nothing to occupy them, it was definitely great to have it. It was definitely a blessing. So she spoke about getting pet lambs for her children, for example, giving them small jobs on farm to sort of occupy them, and she felt it was a great resource. So one farmer I spoke to had actually had COVID-19, And for her, it was the experience of working on farm while having COVID. There were different dynamics that made it maybe slightly easier, in that she felt that she had a greater space over this period of time, and felt that there was not as much claustrophobia as there would be in a different sort of environment. So she said, couldn't imagine someone sitting in a flat 5 stories up in a different country, maybe having no family network around them, maybe being told, oh, you have to stay in your room for 2 weeks. I found it hard enough to isolate as it was, but I put my wellies on every day, and I'm out in the yard and out in the field every day working. And if I wanted to go for a walk, I walked around the land. So there was a sense, I think, of a greater space or greater freedom during the pandemic in general, amongst those I spoke to, but also with this individual. However, there was also risks and dangers that were associated with this. And this farmer spoke about a sort of a feeling of isolation in terms of not having assistance on farm when she became sick, not having any help, and even when she had a severe illness, having to continue working on farm because her animals had to be fed and had to be cared for. And for her, this was a very frightening experience. So a very prominent feature of my interviews was the effect that COVID-19 has had on rituals of death and mourning in rural communities. And many of these brought with them great anxiety related to spreading the virus. So someone said, I think that it would be one of the hardest parts. There was a tragedy there where someone was killed, and you went along to the church and stood around because I knew him so well. But then you feel that you were doing something wrong because you can be too close to people. You feel like you're not comfortable. You feel like if you were too close to somebody and if something happened after, there's a fear on you, you know? I went over there to visit 2 elderly neighbours, and if they had got it and you had been there, like, it really would have been hard. That's why people are so afraid. And a younger farmer I spoke to had said there were friends whose parents in a couple of circumstances where their parents passed away during the last year, and that was difficult. Like, you couldn't be there as support that you usually would be. Usually you would rally around friends in those situations, and I found that difficult, that you couldn't do what you normally would do for them. I felt a bit useless. That was tough for sure. And he spoke about different ways that people try to adapt to this situation. People stood along the route on which the hearse would pass, and spoke about the limitations of this. For example, that wearing masks, people actually didn't know who had come to the funeral and who had not. But then he went on to say that different online resources had also allowed people to express condolences as well. So there's this sense that using technology also to adapt to the pandemic too. So in terms of different experience over time during COVID-19, many farmers felt that the first lockdown was the most difficult as it was frightening and unprecedented. Others spoke about the third wave as being harder because it was a more contagious variant. And one farmer as well spoke about a sense of foreboding coming up to Christmas because they anticipated more people socializing and a new surge of infections. So in conclusion, I found that farmers in Ireland face a number of challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, many seen benefits in being a farmer in this period. This included a secure income, relatively little disruption to working routine, and a capacity to adapt to online resources where necessary. Technology allowed for greater social support at this time. However, some interviewed feel that it limited and cannot substitute for in-person contact. While the farmers I interviewed did not feel themselves to be isolated, many spoke about their concern for older farmers living alone during the pandemic. And so in order to further investigate this, I intend to interview a greater range of farmers to investigate the impact of COVID-19 on well-being. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear that sort of like different approach to how COVID's been discussed as well. It's actually quite similar to one of the research projects that I was involved in before PhD, and it's really nice to hear, like, you've obviously done it so much better and so much more in depth, but it's really nice to hear like the positives kind of coming out of it. We've got a few questions in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Mike's put one in. Has there been any more pressure on the sector to produce more? For example, panic buying. Did any of your results show an impact due to this? And he's aware that you've kind of touched on it towards the end, but just any more kind of discussion around it?
Well, no, farmers I spoke to, like, they felt that many of them who I spoke to, they felt that they weren't directly impacted economically in the way that, you know, so many sectors of the economy were. So there was a sense that prices had dipped because of hospitality closing down, but then that quite quickly, say milk, for example, the price of it went up again because people are at home, and then they're sort of buying similar products that they would have bought through the hospitality sector. So generally speaking, I think people felt themselves to be more insulated from the economic effects of the pandemic.
That's great, thank you so much. We've had another question from Rich as well. Sorry if I butcher how I read this, I'm really sorry, I can't read very well off screens. So he's put that he read that in the US, the closure of slaughterhouses caused a bottleneck in food supply chains, with many agricultural animals unable to be killed for food, and instead large culls required, with linked emotional stress for farmers. Embarrassingly, I have no idea if this was US specific or if there was anything similar in Ireland. I wondered if you were able to kind of discuss that as well.
So there were actually a number of meat processing plants in Ireland that had large outbreaks of COVID-19, particularly in the Midlands. But the farmers I spoke to had not referenced that as impacting on them specifically. And I don't know if that's maybe something if that's something like specific to the geography of where I did the interview. So I tried to focus on the border region of Ireland because there was a very high number of cases, and it's also a very rural area with a high proportion of farmers. But in terms of, like, people did speak about comparisons for the experience of meat processing workers and the experience of farmers. So I actually interviewed recently someone who worked as a clinical contact tracer during the pandemic, and she had conversations with a number of farmers through her role as a contact tracer. But she had spoken about actually occupations were recorded in the sort of data that was collected by them, but she'd noticed sort of how few farmers actually she had come into contact with, which would maybe support what I'm coming across anecdotally as well. The people felt quite secure in the work environments on farms, and she'd noticed how many meat packing workers she'd come across, and so in terms of a contrast there, like almost the complete opposite environment, you know, where you're brought into a space, you have actually very little control over your work environment. You're working very, very close to someone else for a long period of time indoors, whereas the farmers I spoke to, I think they felt that they maybe had a lot of authority over their own work environment. If someone came to visit the farm, they were maybe able to negotiate, okay, you stand over there and you do that and I'll be over here, you know, and they were able to work around it. So yeah, definitely people had noticed the kind of different experience between farmers and meat processing workers in Ireland. But in terms of meat plant closures having an impact on farmers, that wasn't something that people had spoken to me about. Yeah.
Thank you, that was really well answered as well. I have like one final personal question kind of added into it as well. You kind of touched on how age demographics are kind of giving you different sort of influences through your research. I wondered if there was any kind of thought behind agricultural shows and how they weren't able to kind of go ahead as normal. I just wondered if you'd kind of reflected on that in your research, particularly for younger farmers.
Yeah.
More of a sense of community, if that had like a longer term impact on not being able to go to the shows. Yeah,
that's very interesting actually. That is something I should consider, because agricultural shows are a very important feature of farming life, and like events like the ploughing championships as well. I think that's like an important event for younger farmers as well, connecting with each other. So what people tended to speak about with me was the closures of marts, and about how they felt that this would affect individuals who maybe went to 2 or 3 marts a week. And some people had said that they felt that there was maybe older farmers for whom they would go there, they would go to a canteen there and buy a dinner, and that this may be one of the few square meals that they would get a week, you know, from maybe a very isolated cohort of farmers, and where they connected in with other people. And for a job that's kind of so all-encompassing, people sort of define themselves by their work in an important way. And people sort of said to me that they felt it was important for farmers to be alongside other sort of colleagues or peers in a social context, you know, that this was maybe particularly important for them. So market closures was something that people kind of had concerns about. Generally speaking, it didn't, the farmers I spoke to, they felt it didn't impact on them, but they kind of thought about older people in the community who they thought were worse off for that. Things such as, like, generally speaking, going to shops, and people felt that they were kind of trying to come and go quite quickly. They weren't maybe meeting neighbours in shops in the way that they had previously. They weren't meeting neighbours in sort of supply stores the way they would have previously. But also, I think that people sort of found ways around this. You know, some people I spoke to said they would call to other people's farms or to other people's houses, maybe keep a distance, or in some cases maybe not. But people connected a lot as well online, you know. So in that way, they sort of circumvented it. But yeah, I think agricultural shows, that's an interesting one. That I think that would be an interesting question to consider going forward.
That's great. Thank you so much. Like, I really appreciate all 4 presentations. They all were equally amazing. If anyone has any other sorts of questions, pop them in the chat now, or forever never ever get them answered. What we've got now is we've kind of timed a 5-minute break before we move into the next session, which looks at relationships of the body. So you've got 5 minutes to ask any final questions that you want. If you don't have any questions, pop away for a little cup of tea, come back for the next session with Tom. So yeah, thanks again. I really appreciate everyone kind of getting involved with the session. If you have any questions, stick a hand up right now, or pop them in the chat, and I'll keep monitoring them just now. But thanks so much to all 4 presenters. We really appreciate your time.